Europe's population is getting older and older, and by the end of the century, we expect that more than a third of all people will be more than 65 years old. At the same time, we're getting fewer and fewer children, so there is a really big risk that our population will decline over the next decades. About these trends and about their possible political and economic implications, we will talk today during the 5th episode of Moving Europe podcast. Our guest is László Andor, former European Commissioner, and now serving as Secretary General of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. And we are so happy to have you here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me on this very, very complex subject.
Thanks a lot. And we cannot tell you how excited we are, because we really think that this is a topic which is not really present in the political debate. And at the same time, we know that several authors and researchers warn that the demographic shifts which are happening at the moment could be a time bomb. And so we want to start with the most obvious, but also the most fundamental question. And this is, why should we care about demographic changes in Europe at all?
I think it might be true that demographics as such is complex and not always present in the political discussions, but some elements of the demography are very often present, like migration, for example, because demography altogether is about the births, the deaths, and the migration and some of the population movements in between. There is not only just an obsession with migration in certain political corners, but also more recently we are witnessing a rise of pronatalism. And this is also pretty much politically framed. But sometimes such views can be extremely loud, forceful on the political agenda, and sometimes you have to look at it at face value, and sometimes you have to find out what is the real value of this.
Yes, and one point indeed is the pronatalist policies. But what is important for the audience, I think, to understand is that lifespan in the West is becoming longer and longer. People are living more, and this is clear. It's happening due to improvement in healthcare and innovation. But on the other hand, we are making less and less children. So the ideal replacement rate for the audience is 2.1. And in Europe, we are around 1.4. If you have to say like 3 main aspects that are contributing to falling fertility rates in the EU, what would you say?
Well, first of all, it's not only the EU. Right? The fall of fertility rates is a global tendency, with a few exceptions like Sub-Saharan Africa, for example. There are many cases also in Asia where birth rates have been falling, sometimes artificially. The Chinese case is very well known. It has been a policy, and it's a highly disputed policy now. People say it was a folly, right, to try to intervene in such ways. But indeed, we have to look at the last 100 years or even longer, because indeed the question is why fertility rates have been falling for a longer time. But we also have to ask, in my view, why so many children were born beforehand. And especially in peasant communities with a peasant lifestyle, children being born was also the economic security for the next generation. It was part of the social norms to assume that the children will take care of the elderly if people live a longer life. And we shouldn't forget that for a very long time, also in Europe, there was child labor, which means that children were not only expected to contribute when they already grow up, but teenagers, sometimes even younger, were expected to participate in the work on the farm or even in factories or in services sometimes. So there was a long period when the explanation for high birth rates was related to such expectations and the economic insecurity, low income. And as incomes grow, as the education level of the population grows, as women's education also improves substantially, and also the women's income improves substantially, as social security is introduced, and people can rely on solidarity systems and not only their own children if something happens to them in working life or in adult life, then slowly this is percolating into the social norms and results into falling birth rates.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I think this is very interesting. So can we say that one of the factors for falling fertility rate is also a progress of society?
Yeah, definitely. Exactly. Yeah. And that's why for some people, and including myself and everybody, it's a little bit of a difficulty how we interpret all this, because in the longer term horizon, historically, we can say there are a lot of positive developments. There's a lot of progress. Also, we haven't mentioned the improvements in medical science, and you had all the Pasteurs and the Flemings and the Semmelweis who contributed to saving children and saving mothers one way or another, and then also improving the demographics because of this. But then if we look at the recent period, the last few decades, perhaps especially the last 15 years, then there is indeed an additional drop in birth rates resulting from economic insecurity. So economic insecurity seems to be coming back, but the result of this, at least at the moment, is not increasing birth rates, but postponing childbirth or abandoning a second opportunity to have a child, or relating decisions within the family or for the individuals.
Yeah, that's very interesting. But I would also like to understand if in your opinion, there is also a cultural aspect on this. Is there a race of individualism in the West or in the EU that make young people want to have less children, and also decide that remaining childless is also an option? Because the last survey of Eurobarometer in 2020 claimed that around 20% of young people, regardless of socioeconomic condition, they prefer not to have children. Do you think this is realistic?
I think the individualism plays a role. It, for example, can be observed when you look at marriage rates, right? Marriage for some time, for decades probably, also has been eroding. Although divorce is something which can be very volatile, sometimes increasing, sometimes decreasing. But it's probably true that as a tendency, more and more children are born out of the wedlock. So it's another change in the cultural norms. But if you look at these numbers, let's say 20% would say that they don't want to have children. I'm not convinced that this is directly linked to individualism or the changing social norm. It's more the reflection of the insecurity. What is behind us since the great financial crisis? It's more than 15 years. A stagnation, economic shocks, financial insecurity, housing crisis in different countries, and then in the last decade, climate anxiety. On the top of everything, plus in the last 3 years, an increased militarization and the insecurity from the perspective of having or not having a war in our continent, which directly affects us. So if you add all this up, it might result in statistics, but this is subjective, right? So sometimes people say something which expresses the state of mind or the state of the psyche at the moment. When people, for example, say, I would like to emigrate, I leave this country because I cannot, and then sometimes 50% of the young people would say that, but they would not, right? Eventually they would not. So maybe 20% said, I would never have children, but it might not be the case at a later stage.
At 18 years old, then
you don't know.
It's complicated.
But I think we can, of course, discuss about the different causes which can contribute to this. But I think what's also clear when looking within Europe that there are very strong also regional disparities. Yes. So in some countries we see that already now actually the population has been declining quite strongly over the last 20 years. We saw some figures which really stuck with us. For instance, I think Latvia lost some 18% of their population over the last 20 years. This similar numbers for Lithuania, for Romania and Bulgaria, a bit bit less, but still more than 10% loss of the population. What do you think that the causes are first for this? And second, what does it mean for also for Europe's solidarity and cohesion of the Union and of the continent?
Well, indeed, Europe, or even the European Union, only 27 countries, not homogeneous. This is very important. Where there is some kind of convergence or homogeneity, if you like, is the falling birth rate, right? So fertility, from this point of view, seems to be converging. There are some cases where it's, let's say, 1.6, 1.7, that's the high, but the lows are 1.2, 1.3. And this doesn't show a very strong regional pattern. On the other hand, the diversity is indeed life expectancy, and then the population growth. Why? Because the intra-EU migration also affects the overall outcomes, which means that you can have low fertility in Western Europe, but there is a lot of immigration. And low fertility in the eastern half of the European Union. But if there is emigration, then it aggravates the situation. And since especially is the younger generation which leaves, because they would like to work in Britain, they would like to work in Germany, then in the next decade, there will be further drop in the birth rates, because if the Poles, if the Latvians, if the Romanians give birth, many of them will give birth in Western Europe.
But so it could also mean that for Western Europe, actually, even though there may be lower fertility rates, the overall population might stay more or less stable, no? While in the eastern and southern parts of Europe, the decline might be even stronger.
Indeed. So the European imbalances are growing from this point of view. This is also something we have to pay attention to.
And on this, I think Italy, unfortunately, is a good example of this imbalance, very low fertility rate.
Also for us, a lot of young Italians are in Belgium, for instance.
No, exactly. But I would say that fertility rate of Italy is one among the lowest in the EU. And another point that is claimed by experts or people that are interested in demographics is that it's true that we will have fewer people, people in the working age. But on the other hand, you have technological process that is unprecedented in history. And there is a claim that if productivity increases like skyrockets, for example, you don't need the same number of workers as before, because the output produced by fewer workers plus technology is going to be the same. What do you think? Is this true? Can technology be enough to offset the trend?
From the point of view of economic prosperity, if you measure it especially in the GDP, it is true that if the next generation is more productive, then it's not going to be a big problem that every year more people leave the labor market than enter the labor market, right? Just because the retiring generation is more numerous than those who enter newly. From the point of view of population growth, it's probably not going to compensate, right? So such, let's say, additional productivity is very, very unlikely to have an effect which would be halting the population decline, if the population decline is dictated by the falling fertility and very limited immigration to specific countries.
Okay.
And so, but I think then it's very clear that if we say that productivity will not be enough to offset these demographic changes, it's quite obvious that there will be also strong economic repercussions on the European economy. And I think what's really interesting here is that even though this is true, the demographic factor is almost completely missing from the current competitiveness debate, which is raging in Europe. Everybody's talking about it. But so first, I would like to ask you: do you think that the demographic aspect is as important as all the aspects we're currently talking about? So the capital markets union, the single market, research, innovation. And if so, what do you think are the reasons that it's so absent from the overall political debate?
Maybe this is absent from the front line of the political debate, but it's a political choice, right? It's a choice of the leadership, what they would like to discuss most of all, and what remains in the background. Because in the background, for example, in the recent years, there was a report 2 years ago by Anna Diamantopoulou about the future of the welfare states, which was also dealing with questions of social protection, social investment, and long-term care, which is answering much of the questions regarding the demography. Well, there was a 1 year ago report by Elisa Ferreira, the previous Commissioner on Cohesion, about these regional imbalances and how the cohesion policy can address this. But the choice today is to discuss most of all the Draghi report. But it's true that the Draghi report is incomplete if you don't look at a human capital leg. So maybe it's not demography as such, which a competitiveness debate would require, but not to discuss human capital is an omission. It's a flaw in this discussion, and it would be absolutely necessary also because it connects with some of the manifest goals of the European Union. Because, for example, there is an objective that was set about 5 years ago to increase the participation in lifelong learning to 60% of the workforce. And if you think about the aging of the workforce and the potential shrinking of the workforce, then this investment in lifelong learning is an absolutely strategic question.
Yeah. But why is that, in your opinion? Why is outside the agenda?
I can only say again, it's a political choice of the current leadership, which was established after the European Parliament elections. There is a certain type of interpretation of the economic malaise of Europe, why the European countries, or many of them, stagnate. So I think there is an incomplete analysis at the high level of the current situation. There is, I would even say, kind of cognitive dissonance regarding the global trends of economic security and insecurity, how all this is connected with the new types of relations and disputes in the transatlantic area. So there can be many reasons why nominally demography is on the table, right? It was the previous von der Leyen Commission which first time put demography into the title of a commissioner. So in a way, this is more present than before, but maybe the sufficient space and competencies are not given to the people who are responsible for this.
I think it's quite interesting because we talked a couple of months ago with Marco Buti, the previous Director General of ECFIN and then Head of Cabinet of Gentiloni, and I think he said a bit similar things like you do now. So he also criticized, for instance, Draghi for having a bit of a blind spot when it comes to the social dimension of competitiveness. So I think it reflects very well also what you've been saying.
Yes,
now.
But for fairness to Mario Draghi, at least he said as much that the previous notion of the competitiveness was wrong, because 10-15 years ago there was an obsession to connect competitiveness with low tax, low wage. So it helped generating this kind of wage dumping, internal devaluation process in the Economic and Monetary Union. And luckily, Draghi clarified that this is not the type of competitiveness which we would need to see.
So with this race of neoliberalism, that you think have an impact on if you could assess the impact of a neoliberalism view on the economy, on fertility and demographic?
Well, indeed, it's also a question of competition, but what it means in the labor market. So you mentioned neoliberalism, which is, let's say, this big story of the last 30-40 years. And indeed, this brought about a kind of paradigm which was also represented by the OECD, which suggested that in the labor market, for example, you have to go for a lot of flexibility because that creates labor market competitiveness, etc. And then if that's the only solution, and you have flexibility without the security, which is the Danish idea, right? Brought by Rasmussen when he was Prime Minister of Denmark, then it actually undermines let's say the social status of many employees, especially the young ones, and then you have this increasing share of the precariat. Right? So in the last 15 years, we talk a lot about the precarious employment, but precariat practically as a class emerging, and the corona added another layer to this precariat, because a lot of young people only manage to find employment in the platform economy. And if that's the case, you will not have a long-term stable income, because you might as well be working for a 0-hour contract. It will take an eternity to have for you an apartment, let alone a house. So also acquiring decent housing is also postponed. Young people, especially in Italy, stay in the Mama Hotel, right?
We know that.
Hotel Mama.
It's not a joke.
We are the worst, say the you for this.
I don't need to tell you, right?
No, it's okay.
But we broke it.
I clearly know. And indeed, you mentioned precariat, and Italy, that is a very good example of precariat. Unfortunately, we just had a referendum last weekend with a very good results of 1 out of 3 voting. That was horrible. But despite that, I think also in this framework, the role of aging, also in old people, sometimes is seen as too negatively, the fact that a society is aging, for example, also during COVID, or the impact on the labor market of an aging population or a share of pensioners is also important, because they can allow to free childcare, for example, childcare, and also allowing both parents to work. That's also the case, for example, in my family. And the impact on the EU GDP of the fact that both parents can work and there is free childcare is also important to consider. Do you think in the demographic debate is also considered the contribution of the silver economy, or there is too much a pessimistic emphasis on the fact that society is aging?
I think there should be an element of optimism here, because if you look at the last about 25 years, since the so-called Lisbon strategy of the European Union, one of the elements of progress where the EU countries managed to step forward was the increasing the employment rate in the age category above 50. Right? It's a bit unfair to call this age category the older workers, but there is certainly a truth in this. The point is that I think you don't necessarily need the government to tell you that if we live longer, then you have to maintain some kind of balance between those in employment and those in retirement. Otherwise, we risk the adequacy of the pension. Because if you have to distribute in the pay-as-you-go systems among much more people the same amount of pension or even less contributions, then of course you open the door to the impoverishment of the elderly, which relies on this pay-as-you-go pension system. So something needs to be done. And again, the positive element is that we are aging, but we are aging in better health than before. So if that's the case, people should not fear a later retirement, a postponement of the retirement. But of course, it's a difficult task of politics in each country. Right?
Yeah, sure.
In Italy, but also in France, also in other countries, to somehow ensure that there is a kind of shared understanding in society of these demographic trends, and a shared responsibility for public finances.
Sure. And so considering this aspect of working for long time and health, I think you pointed well the fact that we are aging but still remaining healthy in a certain sense, but there is a huge discrepancy between the life expectancy and the health years. I think between men and women, you can correct me, is around 63 healthy years estimated by the WHO, but the lifespan is clearly longer. Do you think governments are putting enough emphasis on aging in a good way, like in a healthy way, for example, in terms of food policy, awareness of fitness, sports? Do you think there is also an investment in this regard?
Definitely not enough.
Okay.
Right? So it's I could recall that in 2012 we organized a European Year for Active Aging and the solidarity within the generation. So that was a type of EU intervention which was not kind of beyond what people would consider legitimate, because sometimes people say, okay, the EU should not interfere with these questions, but you can still promote the concept of active aging, and the employment policies of different countries can connect with this very well. But more investment would be needed indeed, because if we assume that this that not only the longevity will increase, people live longer life, but also potentially active life, then it's not going to be just one career. People can have one or a second or even a third career in their lives, and then depending on the physical conditions, depending on other aspects, you would need to help to prepare for the next stage of the career, or some kind of change according to the needs and the opportunities.
Yeah, and still, while for sure there can be investments done in these areas, it's also clear that you need to have the public revenue for that, right? And of course, one consequence of the demographic shifts is that there most likely will be less workers in the labor force, and so we're wondering, in your view, with the declining workforce and with more need for public investment, for instance, in healthcare, long-term care, and so on, how can we ensure the continuity of public services? Do you think that, for instance, there could be a bigger role on capital taxation, or how can we go about this?
Yes, that's the point number one, that of course not all taxation needs to rely on labor, right? So labor force contributes to taxes, but there's a variety of taxes which you can rely on, and very importantly, I think in Europe, but also North America, maybe even more in North America, USA, what we witness is a tax injustice. Right? So there was also a campaign last year just to tax better the top 1%, and so I think these demographic trends should also renew the efforts to establish better tax justice. This is very important. The other interesting point which I would add is that when we speak about these social services, very often we automatically assume that it's going to be a public sector service provided by the public sector. I think there have been experiments with public-private partnership. To some extent, the private sector also plays a role, because part of these activities or services are profitable, or it can be also the third sector. In some countries, the third sector is developed more than elsewhere. So there can be an innovation, or if you want, an experimentation with different forms of service. Of course, not experimentation with the patients, or if we speak about health, but experimentation with different models.
And I think I recently heard, just to follow up on this, that you mentioned the US and the unfair tax system, which might be true on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's also the case that apparently in the US, for instance, there are more cases of community-based care or family-based care, much more than in the EU. So I think if we talk about public or private, we can also talk about more individualized forms of caring, or of forms of providing these services.
Well, yes, sometimes, indeed, the United States of America has a much more underdeveloped welfare state than basically all the European Union countries. But it's true that sometimes then the US can surprise. For example, at the time of the COVID, they rolled out massive income support. Right? So it was faster than in some of the EU countries. So the fiscal capacity is great. So that's also very important to learn from the US. They have an enormous federal level fiscal capacity, which the European Union should also take as an inspiration.
Yes. Yeah, and on this, I think the most important risk to consider, I will say, is that aging can be indeed a representation of a progress of society, but can also be, in one extent, like a kind of regressive tax, because in the end, if you to pay the pension of these people that are going to pension, indeed, you rely on income. you can risk to affect also negatively the middle class and the low class more than, for example, people that have much of their wealth, for example, in assets or in properties. And I would like to ask you do you think that the demographic crisis and the aging society, or generally the West, how is going to impact the political outlook of the West?
Very interesting. One starting point is that the increasing share of the elderly, right?
Yes.
So I think according to the projections, in maybe 1 or 2 decades, we will have, let's say, 15% of the population over 80.
Yeah.
Right? So it's and then let's say 1/3 in retirement, or what we consider today a retirement age. Let's put it this way. And but the elderly is more active voter than the youth. And from this point of view, I think you can consider the elderly as a political stabilizer. The elderly has a lot of political experience because they have been voting, through their whole life, many elections, and from this point of view, I think this is again something positive. Let's assume the elderly also has wisdom, and
let's hope.
Which is not to downplay the capacity of the young generation, but life experience allows for a lot of conclusions, also regarding politics.
This is actually quite interesting. I never heard this angle of the debate. Usually you say, if there are more older people, then their interests will prevail over younger voters. But of course, this is a perspective which is quite interesting and could be equally applicable.
I'm not denying the point you are raising, that we need to be attentive to the question of the youth, and to avoid that the perspective of the youth is completely subordinated to many issues. But for example, what is the elderly want? The elderly wants constant income. The constant income means constant demand in the economy. So in a way, from the point of view of having a decent amount of aggregate demand, the elderly perspective is very important. Right? So it's
of course. No, and I think this is a good objective of the episode, because also we debunk a bit the fact that aging is necessarily negative. There are also some positive aspects related to that. But now, since we were talking about the political outlook, I would like to try to move to the geopolitical aspect. So the European Union in 2100, according to projections, the population will shrink, and we will be around 3.5-3.6% of the world population. You will still have India as the first country, then countries like Nigeria that will become more than 500 million with an average population less than 30 years old, which is really impressive. The US more or less remains stable, maybe a bit growing. China, second place. But if the EU is going to be 3% of the global population, and it will be also with a median age that is way higher than, for example, Nigeria or emerging economies, do you think we could still have a say geopolitically, or will be even worse than today?
Well, indeed, the population size matters, but the income level also matters. Established, political security capacities matter in the international relations, so I wouldn't expect that Europe's role would decline that fast. But the tendency is something which we would need to indeed appreciate, that for many reasons, economic, social, demographic, there is a tendency towards what we call multipolarity. And that's what the Europeans would need to better understand, that this is something which is a long-term trend. And again, this is also a positive trend, that the world is not, organized and run from one single center, but there are many centers. And I think what Europe also would need to work on is to ensure that there can be a peaceful coexistence between different centers, and a good cooperation across many countries irrespective of their population size and GDP per capita, for global objectives, because there's so many global objectives which connect us. Sustainability is an umbrella term which has many dimensions: the climate sustainability, social sustainability, economic one, institutional, cultural. So in a way, for the sake of sustainability, there would need to be a good cooperation in different fora. Multilateralism would need to be upheld, even if with the current situation in the United States, it's very difficult to uphold all elements of multilateralism, but at the end of the day, this needs to prevail.
And this vision you outline goes a bit, again, more towards the side of cooperation, a bit away from this view of power competition, no? Which is, I would say, especially in the last years, prevailing a bit in the geopolitical debate.
Yes.
And I think I
don't like it.
Yeah.
I think most Europeans do not want to end up in this kind of Hobbesian world, right? Which, you have everyone's struggle against everyone else, because that has in the back of the mind this little bit Darwinist, social Darwinist approach, which, okay, this is a kind of European legacy in the mentality, but I think it's very important to make some efforts to reduce the Eurocentric elements in our thinking. We need to be a little bit more globalist in our thinking.
Yeah.
Also, demographic trends are also global.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one, as you say, is the, let's call it the external dimensions, and as you explained, the demographic shifts do not necessarily need to entail that Europe declines as a geopolitical actor, if we see it more from a coordination standpoint. But at the same time, we would also like to ask you how you think that demographic shifts within Europe affect Europe's ability to address internal political challenges. Like, for instance, now we're talking a lot about the twin transitions, so the green and the digital transition. And I think it's really two types of political views you can have on this. Either you argue, okay, fewer people are actually good for the planet because they're less resource intense, and that's how some people argue. And the other side argues, well, but with fewer people, you cannot actually bring about the innovation needed for the clean tech revolution, which is needed to fulfill our green objectives. How do you see this debate?
That's a lot of questions at the same time. And I would even like to add to the previous one, that indeed, if the European relevance is the concern, that the European unity is even more important. Right? If Europe is fragmented and there's a lot of internal hostility in Europe, then Europe will not be taken so seriously by the rest of the world, especially if we don't understand the rest of the world. So this is an important part of it. And then indeed to come to terms with the important tasks which are ahead of us, like the climate policy. I think it's not so easy to tell whether a shrinking population is better or worse for climate for the climate agenda. It depends on who is eliminated, if I can use this expression. Because let's be honest, much of the climate problem comes from the consumption style and the investment decisions of the top few percent, right? So it's not the big bulk of the population which is pursuing a wasteful lifestyle. And for in any circumstance, even if there would be no aging and shrinking population, it would be very, very important to address the wasteful lifestyle and investment decisions of people on the top of the society and sometimes the top of the economy. So in a way, the knowledge, the awareness of population aging and shrinking might actually accelerate such political processes that would help this kind of stabilization, and then confirming that sustainability in its complexity is important for the humanity. Now, what is the connection with the technological change? That's very interesting, because first what we experience, even before we really come to terms with the population decline, is the shrinking workforce. And the shrinking workforce can be an incentive for technological change. So it's not the technological change that exists objectively, and then we deal with it somehow, but it actually incentivizes. So even more than 100 years ago, when there was a labor shortage in the United States, that was incentivizing technological development. The Edison era with a lot of inventions was basically a consequence of not having enough labor in the United States in those times, until they believed that they have too many immigrants and they changed the policy. So if in the recent decades, in the past 2 decades, for example, not having enough workforce in Japan and Germany also resulted in a big push for automation and robotization, right? Yeah. It's these countries where you have the highest number of robots. Why? Because it was a necessity to somehow compensate for labor shortage in these countries, and that helped to sustain the competitiveness of the industries in these countries. So in a way, the robotization and artificial intelligence can be part of the solution, but only in the sphere of the economics.
Yeah,
and it's not a universal solution, because if there is also an emotional side of having families and having children, and for that, of course, the robot doesn't compensate.
Yeah, and looking at the emotional side, indeed, what you express just is that also a possibly laissez-faire view on the demographic policies can also have positive impacts, for example, in innovation and automation. And we also seen that in some cases, such as indeed South Korea, there were a lot of investments in pro-natalist policies, but the results were not as expected. And here I think you have two sides, like people that would like to see government intervening and being very present in encouraging people to have children and to raise families, and others that think that the government should stay a bit out of this personal decision that indeed is deeply subjective, emotional. There are many aspects. And also looking at the fact that sometimes pro-natalist policies are not working, so maybe there may be cultural aspects behind, and the fact that a shrinking workforce can also led also to a progress of society to a certain extent. Where do you stand between these two views?
Yes, I have a lot of comments on this. Number one, just indeed to agree that indeed, if we consider that this financial support and incentive is the essence of the pro-natalist policy, indeed, as you said, it's not working, right? You don't need to go as far as South Korea to witness this. You can see Hungary. In Hungary also, a lot of money was thrown at birth incentivizing policies, but it was orchestrated in a way that it should incentivize especially middle class or even upper middle class. I don't want to explain why exactly, because it would lead a little bit far, but this has been the case, and it has not been working, right? So sometimes the only effect which you witness is the timing of the birth, but not the overall amount of the birth, if in the long run. So when the government was announcing in Hungary a lot of incentives, including interest-free credit and various types of support, then there was an acceleration, and the fertility rate might have gone up to 1.7. But then it's gone down to 1.2. So in a way, you can just introduce a kind of volatility. Also, abortion control, many different type of policies basically result in volatility and different types of cyclicality, which is not necessarily welcome. But anyhow, on the other hand, what I would like to avoid is to say that there should be no effort at all to help those who want to have babies and those who want to raise children. I think there can be many different types of policies, because indeed you can help with the costs. Very often the main concern of the young couple or the young potential mother is the potential costs. And if the costs are expected to be very high, then there is some kind of negative decision. And helping with the cost, helping with childcare, helping with child benefit, helping to solve housing issues. So there can be many issues, helping to find the first employment for the young person. So all these are types of social investment which can have an economic benefit, but also demographic benefit as well. So I think it's not true that nothing can be done for fertility. But purely the so-called financial incentives are not the best method. It's more about the economic security, widely speaking, the job security, ensuring in societies that young mothers do not need to give up their careers. Sometimes the fear is that a young educated woman would need to give up a career. And then sometimes the first child is born very late, and then there is no time for the second child, or maybe the first child is not born either. So it's these concerns can be addressed. It's not true that you cannot do anything about it. On the other hand, I think the point is not only to intervene if somebody wants to intervene, right? It needs to be kind of social norm or a kind of public consensus that these policies would need to be pursued. But it's not only on the birth side, but also the death. We don't speak enough about preventing premature death, right? So we celebrate that people live a longer life, 80, etc. But we also need to pay attention to a lot of problems with mental health, which can result in suicide, and economic insecurity, which can result in various other health problems. This is something which people would need to look at too, and with some investment in mental health, better services, a lot can be done.
And you said now different things where action could be possible, so economic security, housing, but also mental health and different things. So what we would like to ask you also a bit more from the side of your personal experience. We said in the beginning that you were a European Commissioner between 2010 and 2014. And we know that you've also been pushing to make some initiatives aimed to addressing the demographic shifts in Europe. You mentioned yourself the year of active aging, for instance. And we wanted to ask you, what political obstacles did you encounter when trying to push for this agenda? And how did you deal with those obstacles?
Well, I think what was done, including this European Year of Active Aging and in solidarity between the generations, was not... it was much more than minimal. Also because we also followed up with the social investment package, which addressed demographic issues, and a part of it was a white paper on pension. That was probably the most active period of the European Commission to deal with the question of pension, because there was a problem with the not only the adequacy but also the safety and the security of the pension systems in the aftermath of the financial crisis. So this had to be a complex thing. But it's also true that it was one cycle before, in 2006, when Vladimir Špidla was the commissioner, and the commission came forward with a big communication on demographics. And very interestingly, if you read that now, or if you just read the press coverage, a lot of things which we discussed today was already explained. But indeed, the question is why the EU is not engaging in more action. Don't forget that in those times, the EU integration was subjected to many referenda. And in France, in the Netherlands, in Ireland, in other countries, and then eventually in Britain, there were referenda which were either just barely won or even lost, which means that the citizens signal that they don't want the EU to be interfering with everything. I think it's more complex because it's sometimes a criticism of the lack of input legitimacy. We are not involved enough, we don't know enough. Or sometimes it's a problem with the output legitimacy. And we haven't been dealing enough with the output legitimacy question. But anyhow, the perception was that if it's not absolutely necessary, the EU should not go into questions which, let's say, borderline private life. This is the issue here, that yes, we speak about big trends, a lot of questions about economics, labor market, pension, public finance, but it's also about private life. And where do you draw the line between public policy and private decisions of individuals and families? It's very, very sensitive.
Yeah, and here I think, talking about private life, I would like to come back to one very important point that you just made before about the importance of mental health. Indeed, like our society is progressing, lifespan is expanding, but on the other hand, we have seen an epidemic, has also just been published today, of loneliness, of young people struggling with mental health, depression. You just also mentioned suicide, and one of the aspects to that is clearly the difficulty, I would say, of finding a job, clearly, because 1 out of 5 people young people in the EU, they are neither in employment, but neither in education or training. So they are totally also in a situation of social isolation. In Italy, it's even worse, another time, 25%. So here, I would like to know, like, 2 things. First of all, if we should, looking at the skills mismatch, having a different education system, like because society is progressing at a pace, and also the labor market, that it seems to me that the skills taught at school, sometimes they are not aligned. And second, is there enough effort on the mental health aspects, policy-wise, in the EU?
Again, yes, it's a matter of the education. But the second point is how to connect schools and the labor market, what we call the school-to-work transition. And indeed, providing social services, including mental health, is also underdeveloped in most places. From this point of view, the EU is very, very diverse. And there was an opportunity at the time of the COVID to put on the agenda the so-called health union, which, for example, also not on the epidemic questions, but also on health capacity in general, the standards of health services, including the mental health, would have driven towards some kind of common policy space on these matters, and helping also with the capacities. Now, this was an idea. At that point, at the COVID period, it was a popular idea. And now nobody speaks about the health union. Well, I think the justification is there. And exactly to address these imbalances, that in some countries you have very good services, young people can also rely on. In other countries, they haven't even heard of such possibilities. The EU would have a justification. Somehow, as part of the cohesion paradigm, this would make the EU much more popular in a few places.
Interesting. And I think it was also very illuminating what you said before, that in some areas, like for instance demographics, the reason why the EU has not acted, or one of the reasons, was that it would have been perceived as an interference. But at the same time, I think that the national governments are equally struggling to get hold of the situation, and we saw several governments trying to, for instance, reform the pension system. And in France, there was the Yellow Vest movement, partly as a consequence of the Macron government's attempt to raise the pension age. Do you think that other governments would face similar difficulties, and how should we deal with them?
Yes, I think the Yellow Vest was also in the context of taxation, climate-related taxation. But it's true that some kind of division of labor can be useful between the national governments and the European Union. I think the European Union is more credible when it comes to judging the long term. So I think this is an added value of the EU, and the EU could be trusted more for this and also used for this. On the other hand, I also have to admit, because I also experienced it, that in many, many cases, when something is a matter of a social contract or a social compact or the social dialogue or a social pact, people trust their local national environment because they speak the same language, and it's not somebody with a broken English coming here telling you that, look, you have to do this, you have to do that. So people also have a kind of limited capacity to absorb everything, especially if it's the so-called bad news from the European Union. So the balance needs to be found. 10 plus years ago, we tried to argue for pensions. The member states said, "Oh, thank you very much. We can do what we need to do without the EU nudging." Some EU nudging is useful, but the latest story is that in Denmark, for example, there is now a new law to ensure that by 2040 they raise the retirement age to 70. It's a big debate now in Denmark, and it's the same Mette Frederiksen who launched with me the European Year for Active Aging in 2012 at the time of the Danish presidency. So I'm glad she didn't forget all this, but it also comes with basically the necessity of Denmark moving ahead when they have high life expectancy, high employment rates, strong public finances, but they also would need to preserve that.
And if you're saying that the EU could take more care of the long-term thinking, while the nation states could deal with the day-to-day business, let's say, then I'm wondering how this would look in practice. We saw that the European Union in the last years have put in place some legislative measures. Also, for instance, the Work-Life Directive, basically aimed at helping families to reconcile their work and their private lives in a better way. I'm wondering, in your view, from a European-only side now, what could be done to help at least member states coordinate their policies better?
It's coordination, but implementation capacity. Exactly on this specific directive which you mentioned about the work-life balance, I have seen a study which is comparing two countries, one an older member state, the other one is a new member state, and obviously the implementation is much more bulletproof in an older member state than in one of the newer member states. So somehow the EU would need to ensure that if something is on paper, it could be equally, or it would be equally implemented in all different types of countries. And then after a couple of years, you can see if such a directive has made an impact in real life for the common good.
Yeah. And talking about policies that I will say can have different impacts in different member states. Now I think we need to take a moment to discuss about migration. And clearly in the projections, in the trend, I will say that migration played a role in not making the demographic crisis in the EU even worse in terms of fertility or aging, because they are lowering the median age and they are making on average less kids than Europeans. But it looks to me that the current political outlook of the EU is going towards closing borders more than encouraging migratory flows. And outside the political propaganda on both sides, objectively, do you think the European Union with less migration can reverse the trend or will become even more difficult? Because I think that's the important question to know.
Well, overall, as we know, there is a net immigration into the European Union. We use the word net because there is also emigration. Yes. And if we need to think about migration as part of the problem or the solution, then indeed it's not only immigration which we should think about, but also why some people emigrate. And again, it's very important to remember that at the time of the financial crisis, a lot of people emigrated from Europe to Canada, to US, to Australia, when they said, okay, it's going to be a long recession, I will have no job, 20% unemployment, etc. So it's impossible so we need to avoid such experience when the young people for months and months and months do not find a job and completely abandon the possibilities to stay in Europe. So that's about the possibility to reduce emigration. Now, concerning immigration, indeed, it always adds a few million annually, but to 450 million, which is more or less now the European population, to add 1 or 2 million per year, that's basically the small trend which upholds the stagnation or the modest growth of the European population. So without this immigration, this would not, the European population would shrink much faster. But don't forget the east-west migration, which we already talked about. And it's true that from this point of view, numerically, indeed, Western Europe, the higher income countries, are helped by the immigration, and the so-called Eastern countries, the lower income countries of the European Union, not so much. Maybe now the Ukrainian situation is changing this equation a little bit, especially in Poland, Czechia, and a few other countries. But hopefully this is a temporary situation, right? We should also hope that sooner or later many Ukrainians can return to their home countries, and there would be some kind of growth and reconstruction in Ukraine. Although we should have no illusions, right? The more time passes, 2, 3, 4 years after they've fled Ukraine or any other country in war, then the less likely it is that eventually people will return, because they find a job, they find friends, they find a school. The conditions will just keep them in. But the mentioning the war, I think, is important, because many other previous situations of refugee inflow, at least since 2015, have been consequences of wars. The destruction of Iraq, the destruction of Afghanistan, the destruction of Syria, the destruction of Libya, all these wars have resulted in these massive pressures on Europe. And of course, without these so-called shocks, the European population would not notice that much the total amount of immigration. Why? Because it comes slowly, it's a flow, it's connected with the economic job opportunities, and people do not see this that much as a shock or a crisis. And that normally is the case when the proportion of the refugees, which come because of war or political insecurity, remains something like 5 to 10% of the total. But in 2015, it went up to 50, and then the irregularity also increases. So that also is very important to avoid that there are so many wars not far away from Europe, and then to avoid that people become so destitute and they have no other possibilities. And then in more regular ways, Europe could more easily deal with this question. And
here, just one point that I was also quite impressed about, because I know about the Italian brain drain. That is a very well-known phenomenon of young people leaving to other countries in Europe or outside the European Union. But so, do you think we also have a very important problem with European brain drain of the EU as a whole, going to other societies like the US and Canada? Because I was not very much aware of it.
It's very difficult, because brain drain is also an expression which has many definitions, and I think in most of the European kind of statistics, we say there's a brain drain when the highly educated are overrepresented, the tertiary education. I'm sure there is still some, whether it's at the magnitude which we would need to talk about between Europe and the rest of the world. I think with the exception of the crisis periods, it is not the case. When there is a crisis, and then 15 years ago there was a long financial crisis, it probably was the case. And then it probably is the case when there is a major crisis like this, that people with a diploma or even experience as a professional need to leave the country, and they become employed in jobs for which they are overqualified, right? So there is a brain loss. The brain drain also needs to be connected with the concept of the brain loss, that eventually, if you leave your home environment, home country, because of the lack of economic opportunities, it's quite likely that you end up in a job which would require less training or less skills. And that's also a loss for society and a bad experience for the individual. So this is also important because sometimes mobility is presented as a magic solution, as a silver bullet to kind of imbalances when there is a lack of labor here, there is unemployment here. Why not allow people to move? It's not so easy.
Yeah.
It's not. It helps, but these aspects of the mismatch would need to be addressed anyhow.
Yeah. I have one more curiosity before closing, because of course with migration and mobility there are a lot of different aspects to consider. You talked about migration flows as a consequence, for instance, of wars. But another aspect which is often mentioned is that we should have a larger role and have more possibilities to legally migrate to Europe. Do you think that this could also be an aspect which should be increased?
The short answer is yes, but rightly this is pretty much for the member states to deal with this question, because the situation is so diverse that Germany probably needs more than another country which I don't want to name, and especially now that Germany liberated itself financially, and they are going to launch a big armament campaign that also will result in an increasing demand for labor. That will result in further immigration to Germany, where either from European countries or from non-European countries, there is no third option. Right? So it's then something will happen with which the German labor market institutions will have to deal with, but then also the education system, the language learning, and all this is more a kind of chain of events that would need to be set in motion.
A lot of interesting aspects, László. We are at the end of the podcast. We always finish with one particular question, which we pose to each of our guests. Our podcast is called Moving Europe. We call it like this because we want to assess the topics which are moving Europe, but we also want to assess how individual people can contribute to move Europe forward. So in your opinion, how would you propose, if you had one shot only, to move Europe forward? And our listeners and our audience, how do you think they could move Europe forward in their everyday lives?
Well, I think participation is very important. It is a political question, participation, but also for us, we are in a think tank. And then participating in the discussions also helps a lot to bring the real life experience to Brussels. I'm very much pro EU, but I think it's very important that the EU bubble needs to be connected with the real life experience of all different regions, cities, villages of the Europeans, and this exchange will help improving the policies as well.
Yeah, and I hope also this podcast can contribute a bit to this, because we are a perfect example of the EU bubble. We are trying to go outside sometimes. And thanks a lot. It was a very interesting episode.
Thank you for your time.